Okay, good afternoon. Today we are going to talk about the optimum currency area. The idea floated by Professor Mandel in the 60s, early 60s, and the optimum currency area is about the currency unions. So the debate is whether a group of countries should go for having a single currency. Now clearly if there are benefits of doing it, then a group of countries can adopt a common currency. The Europeans have done it, at least from 1999. There are some countries in the Europe who have adopted the common currency, which is called the euro. There are examples of the currency unions or monetary unions in the other parts of the world. For example, former French colonies in Africa have also come together to form a currency union. In the Americas, Ecuador, for example, has adopted its currency to be dollar. That's called dollarization. So it's not a group of countries, but one country which has adopted the other country's currency. And Panama also adopts US dollars. In Asia, we have now ASEAN plus China, Japan, and Korea, which peg their currencies to a basket of currencies. It's like a precursor towards having a common currency for the Asian countries. So ASEAN, which has 11 countries, plus China, Japan, and Korea, have come together to peg their currency to a basket of currencies. If you look at India's history also, India had pegged its rupee to first to especially after the 70s, it had pegged to the basket of currencies. So it had some reserve currencies, and it would peg its currencies to the basket of currencies. That model went on till the early 90s, and from then we have moved to having a market exchange rates. So, but this optimum currency area is dealing with having one currency for a group of countries. Now, what we have been discussing in the class is that if there is a shift of expenditures from domestic to foreign goods or foreign to domestic goods, it leads to imbalances in the economy. You move out of internal and external balance. And so if you have to move back to the equilibrium position, that is having both internal and external balance, then you shift back, you switch back your expenditures. So if you find that a country starts liking goods from abroad, so there is a switch of expenditures from domestic to foreign goods. The only way to bring back your economy into equilibrium is to switch back your expenditures from foreign to domestic goods. That means you depreciate your economy. Now when you have these currency unions, the problem comes that you need to take care of the change in the demand and supplies of the foreign exchange, because at the end you want to maintain a parity. So if you have the demand curve and the supply curve of foreign exchange, so this is so in the currency unions, you would have a situation where each country would peg its currency to this common currency. So if you peg your currency to a common currency and the others also do it, then it is like a fixed exchange rate system working for the entire group of countries within the region. If you look at these handouts that I have given it to you, please refer to the table 21.2 . The table 21.2 in the middle you have a list of 27 countries, 14 countries in the Europe, that's table 21.2, the EU 27 and the Euro project in 2007, table 21.2 in the middle. The handout has nine pages. In the middle, that's page 6th. That's page 6th. Now you see a list of 27 countries. So this EU comprises of the Eurozone countries which have adopted the common currency Euro. There are countries which are part of the EU but not part of the Eurozone, which are countries in the ERM, exchange rate mechanism. So the countries in the ERM, the difference between countries in the ERM and countries in the Eurozone is that the countries in the ERM have their own currency. They haven't adopted Euro, but they have pegged their currency to the Euro. And then there are other EU countries, 7 of them again, which are not part of the exchange rate mechanism, but part of the EU. So EU comprises of countries in the Eurozone, which have adopted Euro, common currency. There are countries in the ERM, countries in the exchange rate mechanism, which haven't adopted Euro, but they have pegged their own currency to Euro. And there are other countries, there are other EU countries which are potential candidates to be part of the ERM. And once you become a part of the ERM, then you graduate to the Eurozone. I'll talk about this graduation from the other to ERM and then to the countries in the Eurozone. But what I want to tell you is that all countries in the EU, they have a Euro parity rate. They have their own national currency which is pegged to the Euro. And the Euro parity rate is given in one of the columns, which is Euro parity euro 1 is equal to 13.760 shilling. 1 euro is equal to 40.3399 franc. So if each of these currencies is pegged to euro, then you can work out the fixed exchange rate between, say, shilling and franc, right? Because each is pegged to the euro. When we had the gold standard, a monetary arrangement that we had from 1870 till the end of the Second World War, you had countries which were pegging their currencies to the gold, to the ounces of gold. Here the difference is that you are pegging your currency to a common currency, which is euro. So it's like a fixed exchange rate system within the region. Okay. Now fixed exchange rate system has its own problem. You have your common currency, it's managed by a central bank, a common central bank for all the countries. So you lose on the monetary independence. You do not have monetary independence in case of a fixed exchange rate. So then, if you do not have a monetary independence, what do you do about the changes in the demands which take place in the economy? An example which is given in the literature to explain this OCA is example of the European Union, where people from, this is what I am talking about, Europe before 90s. So you had one set of countries in Eastern Europe, and you had the rich countries in the western part of the Europe. So, and then you had all sort of restrictions on movement of people, movement of goods, especially in Germany, which was bifurcated into West and East Germany. So these East Germans would always wish to have goods coming from the West, because there were certain restrictions on movement of people, movement of goods. It was very difficult for the East Germans to move to West Germany. Now in this type of scenario, say for example, the East Germans start liking goods emanating from the West. So if it were a floating exchange rate, it wouldn't matter much, because if the demand for the Western goods increases, the demand for foreign currency goes up. Your exchange rate, that means your domestic currency depreciates, the foreign currency appreciates. So the price movements helps you to take care of the changes in the demands which initially changed because the East Germans started liking goods emanating from the West. But in a scenario where you have to maintain this parity, how do you take care of these changes in demand? Or do you do something in the economy to curtail those demand for the Western goods? Now, the adjustment takes place mainly through these 3 points. So, say for example, you start liking goods emanating from the Western world. So, the adjustments, if the exchange rate cannot change, what can change are the prices. So, if you start liking Western goods, the demand for the Western goods would go up, the price of the Western goods would go up. So, if the price goes up, the aggregate demand in their economy goes down, right? And correspondingly in your home country, the prices go down. So, therefore, the aggregate demand in the economy, your economy, goes up. So, it takes care of that shift in the demand for the goods, the foreign goods. So, the adjustments in OCA will take place if there is price flexibility, wages and prices are flexible. Second, because generally it is observed that the prices are sticky, so it would be an advantage for a country to be part of OCA if you have free mobility of factors of production. Why? Because, say for example, again the same example, if you start demanding foreign goods, the production of the foreign goods has to go up. If the production has to go up, the demand for labor, foreign labor would go up, because you need foreign labor to take care of the increase in production. So, the way the adjustments would take place is that here is East Germany, and if they have a common currency, and if they have to take care of the shift in the demand, the labor needs to move from East Germany to West Germany to take care of that increase in demand of the Western goods. So, OCA works if there is free mobility of factors of production. OCA works if you see changes in prices happening. OCA works if you have fiscal federalism, in the sense that you have fiscal union, because if the demand for the foreign goods goes up, the production goes up, the income goes up, the tax that you generate in foreign country also goes up. Okay? So, if the tax goes up, there the aggregate demand in the foreign country goes down. So, then you should have a system where the money from the West should flow back to the East in case initially there was an increase in demand for the foreign goods. So, the tax payments there would go up, the tax payments here in the eastern part would go down, the aggregate demand would increase in your country, the aggregate demand in their country would go down if you have a fiscal union. So, OCA works quite well in those regions where you have all these three: the price movements, factors moving without any problem, without any hurdles, and you have the fiscal transfers taking place without any problem and hurdles. So, then the issue comes that if this is so, then why not that each country or each state inside a country have its own currency? Do you understand this debate? Because if this is so, then say a state of Gujarat within India would also like to have its own currency, because it knows that if it is part of India, there is no problem in the movement of factors of production. You may be born here in UP, but if you get some work outside the state of UP, you can easily move. There are no such restrictions. You may have a fiscal union, you may have this price movements, and if you don't find this, then you can always argue that, okay, let's have our own currency. So then the debate went on to identify whether it is beneficial for or whether EU as compared to the US, are they better candidates for an OCA? So if you look at the handout, the table 21.4, that's table 1 to the third table, compares the performance of the United States and the EU as candidates of an OCA. Now look at the three criterion for an OCA. One is OCA Integration Criterion, the second is OCA Symmetry Criterion, and the third is OCA Labor Mobility Criterion. So after this, there were people who worked on OCA, and they reclassified all these into two points, which were integration and symmetry. So you form a currency union if you are highly integrated with the other regional trading partners, and you have a symmetrical relationship with the other trading partners. Integrated can be in terms of, say, one proxy can be the exports to the rest of the region as a percentage of GDP. This is an integration criterion. And symmetrical relationship is that if each country tend to react in the same manner due to some shocks which happen outside the region. So this point I can explain it like in your family. If you have a group of 4 or 5 family members, then how close are you in terms of your relationship? That's integration. And symmetry is that if there is a shock which happens, there is some problems which emanate from outside. If all the members react in the same way, then you say that you have symmetrical relationships. You tend to react in the same way. So these points, these adjustments were reclassified into integration and symmetry. And then the debate was whether US or EU were good contenders for an OCA, optimum currency area. So this table, which is given in Feenstra and Taylor, they do a simple exercise where They work out the OCA integration criterion, the OCA symmetry criterion, and OCA labor mobility criterion. So if you look at the OCA integration criterion, one proxy for this integration criterion is exports emanating from different states of US to emanating from different states and going to the rest of the United States, or exports emanating from one of the countries in EU and going to rest of the EU countries. So you find that if you look at the US average and if you compare the EU average, the US average is higher than the EU average. That means the states in the states within US, they are more integrated in the sense that more exports are happening from each state going to the other states. So say for example, you want to work this integration criterion for India, then you have to work out how much exports is happening from a state of Gujarat, how much proportion, what's the proportion of exports which is happening from Gujarat and going to the other states in India. So you may call it exports, or you may call it the goods which go out of the states. So if you find this proportion, then you can work out an OCA integration criterion. So from this it seems that US is more integrated than the Europeans, the EU regions. Luxembourg, Belgium are the topmost countries in EU which have very high percentage of exports going to the rest of the European countries, following by Slovakia, Estonia, Czech Republic, Hungary. The least one is Cyprus and Greece. Cyprus, Greece, United Kingdom, they are more closed within the European Union. So look at France, Italy, they are all in the bottom, right? So from outside, anyone who knows about Europe, it would seem that they are very highly integrated economies, but here you find that most of these large, rich countries, they are the ones which are in the bottom. The countries which are on the top are Luxembourg, Slovakia, Estonia, Czech, Hungary, Malta, Ireland, and so on. For US, you have these different states, Great Lakes, Plains, Southeast, Southwest, New England, which are at the top. So as far as integration criteria is concerned, US is more integrated. The states in US are more integrated with each other. So they are a good candidate for having a common currency. If you look at the C point, OCA labor mobility criterion, this is proxied by the population born in a different state of the US or EU in percentage. So again, if you work out the EU average and the US average is far bigger than the EU average. So people who are outside European Union, the general perception is that anyone who is born in Sweden can easily go to the other countries and work there. This is not confirmed by this labor mobility criteria. It seems that US again scores over the Europeans. The Europeans, wherever they are born, they want to work in that same country. They are reluctant to go outside. Okay. Earlier the impression was these Europeans, if you go to Europe, it would seem everything is same. You would meet people who were born somewhere else, and they come and meet you, it would seem that there's full mobility of factors of production, but if you see the data, it would seem that they do not have enough of labor mobility. Again, US scores over the European Union in terms of the labor mobility. As far as the symmetry criterion is that you tend to react in the same manner as the others. If you tend to react in the same manner, then you can say that you are part of a family, you can form a union. So there is a shock which happens, which emanates outside the region, and if the countries within the region, they react in the same way, then you say that there is a symmetrical response. So a proxy for, a crude proxy for this symmetrical criterion is the correlation of a region / country GDP with US / EU GDP. So if you want to find whether Gujarat has a symmetrical response in comparison to the other states in India, you correlate Gujarat's GDP, state GDP with India's GDP. Okay, this is one proxy for that symmetrical criterion. Now here you cannot make a distinction between US and EU. EU's average is more or less same as the US average. Okay. And we have reasons for it because of the fact that many of these countries they don't tend to produce the whole set of varieties. In Europe, you find that countries produce, say, limited set of varieties. They reap economies of scale. They export certain varieties, import another set of varieties. So in Europe, you tend to specialize in different varieties. That's the reason that you may find high correlations in these GDPs, rather than saying that they face the same symmetrical shocks. So what comes out of this table is the fact that both the US is a better contender for an OCA rather than Europe. The next point is how is OCA different from a fixed exchange rate regime? Now what you need to understand is the fixed exchange, a debate about whether the country should go for a fixed exchange rate or a flexible exchange rate. And the reason that I want to discuss this is because this optimum currency area is like a higher form of a fixed exchange rate. Okay. Now, if you read the literature on countries choosing between fixed and flexible exchange rate, they come out with a set of criteria. It is said that countries with similar inflation levels should adopt a fixed exchange rate. Countries with similar interest rates should adopt the fixed exchange rate. Countries which are closed that is trade to GDP is lower, should adopt the fixed exchange rate. Countries which are small, they should adopt the fixed exchange rate. Countries which are more integrated, they should adopt a fixed exchange rate. Countries which face symmetrical shocks, they should adopt a fixed exchange rate. And why? Because if you recall, when we were discussing this open interest parity, if you recall that pi dot, the open interest parity that we got, the expected rate of change of exchange rate was the difference between the interest rate which prevailed in your country and foreign country. So if you do not want any depreciation in your exchange rates, then only, and if the interest rates are same, then pi dot would be equal to 0. That's the reason that you say that if you have similar interest rates, same levels of interest rates, then you go for a fixed exchange rate. Similarly, if you work on the purchasing power parity theory, which says that the real exchange rate EP star by P, it's a constant, and if you work on this equation, you would get E dot E to be equal to P dot P minus P dot star P star. The inflation levels here and the inflation levels in the foreign country. PPP theory says that this real exchange rate is a constant. For the same set of goods, the prices which prevail for the same set of goods are same here and in the foreign country. That's what purchasing power parity means. So if you work on this, you will get E dot by E is P dot by P minus P dot star by P star. So if you have similar inflation levels, there will be no change in the exchange rates. So you can go for the fixed exchange rate. If it's an open economy like Norway and you have a flexible exchange rates, then it would tend to create volatility in your markets. So more open is the economy. This small correction, this shouldn't be closed, this should be an open economy. Correction, open economy. If you are more open, then your trade to GDP is on the higher side, and if it's a flexible exchange rate, then you tend to lose if you have an open economy. So if you have a fixed exchange rate system, then you should, for an open economy, you should go for the fixed exchange rate. Small economies also should go for a fixed exchange rate regime, because remember, in a fixed exchange rate regime, you lose your monetary autonomy. So when you lose your monetary autonomy, it's better that you have a small economy rather than a large economy. Now this, and then you have economies which are highly integrated with each other and they face symmetrical shocks. All these should go for a fixed exchange rate regime. On the other hand, countries which do not have a similar inflation level, similar interest rates, is a closed economy, is a large economy, is not integrated, faces asymmetrical shocks, they should adopt a flexible exchange rate regime. Now the reason that I am talking about this is because this OCA, optimum currency area, is a higher form of a fixed exchange rate regime. It's a hard peg. Here you may have a band, say a band wherein your exchange rate can move, say 2% positive or negative, or it can go till 15%. But here in the OCAs, this band is certainly lower than what you have in a fixed exchange rate regime. The Danish, the Swedish, the United Kingdom, they didn't want to be a part of the optimum currency area. So, if you had seen the earlier table, the entire Europe is divided into Eurozone, ERM, exchange rate mechanism, and others. And see the position of the United Kingdom and Sweden. They are not even part of the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism. That is, they don't want to be part of the OCA. If you want to be a part of OCA, then the first thing that you have to do is you follow certain economic criteria, and then you move to, after 2 years, you move to the ERM, and then in the ERM you peg your currency to the euro, and after this you move to the Eurozone. Now it's an interesting story about the United Kingdom and Sweden. In 1991, when you had that famous Maastricht Treaty which decided on having a euro by 1999, and it also set some economic criteria of joining the European Union. In the initial list, UK and Sweden were part of it, and they agreed to be part of the ERM after, say, a year or 2 years. But then they faced a crisis, they had a referendum in their own countries, and subsequently they opted out of the ERM, and now they are put in the other EU countries. So Sweden and United Kingdom as of today would never want to have their currency to be converted into euro. Denmark, on the other hand, is a part of ERM. It has its own currency krone. It has its own currency krone pegged to the euro, but it's very hesitant to have its own currency as euro. So, so people were reluctant, the countries were reluctant to move from this fixed exchange rate, which is a lower form of the optimum currency area. OCA is a hard peg. Okay. So then the question comes, if you look at this, the second page, that is figure 21.2, it has this interesting diagram which on the x-axis has market integration, and on the y-axis there are symmetry of shocks. And you see a line which, there are two set of lines, downward sloping lines. One is a fix and the other is an OCA. So anyone who joins EU has to first go through, cross this fixed line, and then subsequently cross this OCA line. And the countries which cross the OCA lines are the ones who have higher market integration, and they have symmetrical shocks. Okay. Now, related to related to this is then who joins, who can join this European Union. Now, in 1991 there was a famous treaty which came into being called the Maastricht Treaty. This Maastricht is a place in Netherlands. What it evolved was a set of criteria for joining into European Union. That set of criteria is called the convergence criteria. So, tomorrow if Turkey wants to join the European Union, it has to follow the economic or the convergence criteria given in the Maastricht Treaty. Now, that is mentioned in table 21.3, that is rules of Euro membership. So, the rules of the club or the convergence criteria relates to the exchange rate, inflation rate, the long term nominal interest rate, the government deficit and the government debt. So, if your economy wants to have a member of the European Union, then it has to be in 2 consecutive years in ERM band with no devaluation. So, remember EU, it has Eurozone, it has ERM and there are others. So, if you want to graduate to Eurozone, you have to be part of that ERM, and that ERM is exchange rate mechanism where you need to peg your currency to euro, and this exchange rate has to be stable. There shouldn't be excessive devaluations taking place. Second, this is interesting, no more than 1.5 percentage points above the level in the 3 member states with the lowest inflation in the previous year. So, your inflation shouldn't exceed 1.5% of the averages of the 3 countries which have the lowest inflation. Similarly, there are criterion for the interest rates. Deficit should not be more than 3% of GDP in previous financial year. Government debt shouldn't be more than 60% of GDP in previous financial year. This inflation rate and long term nominal interest rate, these criterions is not coming from anywhere else, but it is coming from the uncovered interest parity. Okay. If you have the same interest rates, then you can have a fixed exchange rate regime. If you have the same inflation levels, then you can have a fixed exchange rate regime. So, second and third have the reason is an economic reason, that is uncovered interest parity and the PPP. Inherent is these, and then government deficit and government debt are talking about having fiscal austerity. No more than 3% of GDP in previous financial year, no more than 60% of GDP in previous financial year. Although you can always question me on these figures, why 3% and 60%, there is no economic interpretation for this. But then these are the set of criteria for joining into the EU, which is like a hard peg. I am repeating, a hard peg. It is much more than the fixed exchange rate regime where your currency cannot even take these bands. Presently in the ERM you can have a 15% band, but as soon as you go for an optimum currency area, you do not see, you are bound to have your own currency pegged to the euro, where you do not see much changes in the value of your currency. Because remember, even though you have euro, you are dealing in euro, inherently if you go to any bank in Europe, when they give you a bill, that bill always mentions the exchange rate between your currency, the currency that you had before 1999, say Italian lira with euro, and that's pegged, that cannot change. You do not, it's a hard peg. And then so then the issue is that what's happening now in Europe, where they are facing financial crisis, people have started questioning whether it is beneficial for Europe to have a common currency, and will it be prudent on part of countries to move out of OCA. And to answer that, it's very, very difficult. Apart from the fact that you have to reprint your own currency again, there are other set of issues. So it was made in such a way that someone who enters OCA cannot go back and have its own currency. Okay. So we will study different parameters of these economies, and we will see whether these economies indeed followed this Maastricht criteria. And to your surprise, you will find, if you that table is also there, the last table, most of the countries didn't do well in terms of the government deficit and government debt, and this is an old data. So the origins of this financial crisis does not lie in these years, the last 2-3 years. The origin lies from 2000, 2001, what's happening from 2001, 2002. They didn't follow their own set of criteria that they had built under the convergence criteria. Okay, so this set of literature is new. This is also only the very second time that I'm communicating, so I do not have that much of confidence, because the literature is coming in on what's happening in OCA. But what you can do is, if you want to compare whether India is a good contender for an OCA and compare it with something which is happening with respect to East Asia, where they have ASEAN plus China, Japan and Korea, whether they or us, if you compare whether we or them, whether we are better contenders for OCA, whether we should have an OCA amongst SAARC, or whether they should have a common currency, and what happens if India joins this East Asia club. Would that convergence criteria, that the OCA criteria, then what will happen to the OCA criteria? So you can think of doing something like that. In SAARC, for example, the economic indicators will never tell you that you have a monetary union. Okay, it will be difficult, but politically it may be a good idea. Like in Europe also, it's more of a political integration rather than economic integration. But what if India joins this East Asia club and you have an OCA, common currency, Asian common currency? I don't know what you will call that in future, but say the Koreans, the Japanese, the Chinese, we all have a common currency. Okay, it's difficult. That was the same thing which happened in the 60s. People would laugh at Professor Mandal and say, what are you talking? Would you have a common currency? So maybe in future. So let us start some work on this. Yeah, have some region, work out these OCA indicators, see whether you can have a common currency. You have these integration and symmetrical criterion, see whether you can work on that, and something new, something can come in. Okay.